we continue. I hope you still have strength, and I think we are still continuing. I don't know if we still continue for the another one. So our next speaker is another of my dear colleagues, May. She is one of our two PhD students. But I can tell you a little story about that. Actually, she started as a student assistant in our project, but very soon we found out, no. We have to promote her and to push her a little bit to finish her studies to become like a PhD student. And because of German bureaucracy, again, she actually had to do a second master. She already received a master from Jerusalem, like Hebrew University, but because of the system, the German crazy system, she couldn't start a PhD immediately. So in a hurry, she did another master, also in Jewish studies. So she became our PhD student, and the second master in Berlin was actually about the subject that she's now also continuing to work on. It's another scribal manual called Baruch Shama. And today she's talking about, based on this actually treatise text from the Middle Ages, about the making of parchment. So, and also, although she's still on a rather early stage of her academic career, which is difficult in itself because of the system again, but she already published here and there in the course of our project some texts of her own, and so to say, to throw her knowledge about this medieval treatises on scribal manuals into the world. So, Anne-May, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good. So the title is Did Jewish Scribes in Medieval Ashkenaz Make Their Own Parchment? So in the title you already see it's going to be mainly about Ashkenaz, but I'm going to make two connections, one directly to Rhodes and one generally to Greece or to the Greek language, just to make it more relevant to you guys. And then it's just because of the nature of the scribal handbook that I work on, and you will see in a second what I mean. I will just briefly give you some context about the manuscript or the text I'm dealing with. So basically it's a handbook that deals with the production and writing of tefillin. Here you see a modern image of one, and I guess most of you know what they look like. But you also see that the second part of the handbook is about the writing of the letters and the Otiot Mishonot that we just heard about. So that's the second big part, and then the third one is just about also something we heard about now, like scribal conventions with regards to Shirat Hayam, or like the opened and closed sections in the Torah. Yeah, and so about my manuscripts, they are mainly, as you can see in the script type, almost all of them are Ashkenazi. From the script type, we have one Italian. This one, and the first one I marked in red, that's the oldest one we have from the Vatican State Library. Yes, and what I'm kind of doing is like and geographically, it's also interesting that the manuscript was copied in many places, so ranging from the place of Italy until the east, even in Ukraine. So it's covering a broad spectrum in terms of time and space that this manual was popular. Yep. The manuscript comes in many shapes and sizes. That's the Italian one. And these are just ideas to give you ideas what they look like. We also have prints. The earliest is from 1798. And this one is the Warsaw print, and we have a modern edition by an Israeli from 1970. But the problem with this one is that he doesn't, for example, include the manuscript images of the letters. And he has really made like an eclectic edition. That means he left out many manuscript witnesses that differed considerably from what he thought was the main text. Just to briefly show you, this is what an edition looks like in our project. This is like a lot of, it looks like code, but it's actually quite easier for humanities scholars like us. And this is what it's supposed to look like later on when we have, where we can actually display it for you guys to work on. And just briefly some context about the nature of the text. So when I'm going to talk about my manual, I'll refer to two rabbis that wrote the text. So we have, on the one hand, we have the base text by Abraham, which is referred to as Tikkun Tefillin. And then we have a second rabbi who commented on it. So don't get confused when I sometimes say Avraham and sometimes Shimshon or Samson. Yeah. And the form of the commentary is also often in marginalia. And that makes it difficult also for people like me who edit the text to differentiate exactly, okay, what did the scribe add, or like the scribe who copied the manuscript, and what was the original author, Rabbi Samson. Like this one, for example. That could just be a scribal note. And then geographically, just something briefly about the rabbis. We have Avraham, who was kind of located in Sinsheim, and he was also mentioned as a chazan in Erfurt around 1330, but I think he probably wrote his manual about tefillin making a bit earlier, because the earliest scribe manual is from 1383, like completed with the commentary, so it must have been written at the end of the 13th or the beginning of the 14th century. And Samson himself comes from Saxony. There he was born, and then when he was 8 years old, his family went to Prague, where all his parents and his siblings died, and he became an orphan, and at the same time an apprentice with the scribe Issachar, and there he learned his skills of writing tefillin. And that's also where he got the manual Tikkun Tefillin by Abraham. And that's when he commented on it, because he learned with it, and then he thought, oh, okay, but a lot of information is missing, I'm going to add to it. And then, interestingly, he describes a lot of places he's been to where he has looked at tefillin and communities, and where they make tefillin as well. So one is Vienna. We have also the land of Bayern, Bavaria, Erfurt, obviously, and then a place in modern-day Germany, Poland, Lusatia or Lausitz. Okay, and now we are ready to begin with our question. Did scribes actually make their own parchment? And it's interesting that actually the consensus in the scholarly world is that in Ashkenaz, they did not make their own parchment. Whereas with regards to Italy, like Spain, like medieval Italy and Spain, people like generally accept, Jews made their own parchment. And before we dig deeper into it, I also want to ask a question. Actually, what happened in the 12th and 13th centuries, and did people wear tefillin? Because many scholars like Elisha Baumgarten, Yehuda Galinsky, they looked into this question. They actually said people didn't wear tefillin back then. First of all, because it wasn't like socially accepted. It wasn't like a thing people would do. And then on the other hand, also it was expensive to buy them. And it was just it's not something that the sources tell us that people did. And we have actually this record of, I'm just needing, exactly, Moses ben Jacob of Kusi in 1236. He went about Spain, but also France and Germany. And apparently he was preaching about this, like to people, that they should actually implement the commandments of wearing tefillin and also having mezuzot in the house, because he said that's important. And apparently he persuaded a lot of people become more religious in that sense. Another thing that happens, or that we see, is like an increase of halachic manuals in minhagim books. So minhagim books are, for example, also like books that tell people what to eat, like what food is kosher, what is not. For a chazan, maybe it would be a manual containing like instructions for him. There are many, many different types, and we see an influx in that in the 13th century. And people have attributed that to the gradual spread of Jews across the Germanic lands. First of all, because of economic opportunities, but also because of increased persecution, especially towards the end of the 13th century. Yeah. And now we come to the point why people, or scholars mainly, think there were no Jewish parchment makers or tanners, like leather makers. And that's because of a citation from Sefer Hasidim, which kind of says, well, that's not a craft that Jews have or hold. Same as builders and tailors, that just doesn't exist, or it is not known of. And similarly, Menachem Haran, a scholar, says Jews had never had a hand in this profession. And there, I just want to make an excursion to Rhodes, because we have two travel documents or travel itinerary stories. One from Benjamin of Tudela, and one of by this Obadiah from 1487, and he actually says very beautifully, like he's really thrilled by the Jews on Rhodes, and he says, without exception, they are intelligent, well-spoken, ethical, cultured, and well-mannered. Even the tannery workers among them wear clean clothing and speak pleasantly. Their hair is well-styled, and they are as handsome as princes. And also the women are beautiful, and they also engage in crafts. So it's very cool that we have the source. And that's one of the reasons why scholars don't question like the existence of tannery workers in Rhodes, but then also we have similar examples for Spain and for Italy. Yes. And generally, if we look at the Talmud, the profession of a tanner wasn't something that is very admirable or like sought after, and actually many passages it's not spoken well of. And woe to him whose profession is that of a tanner, for example. Just because it was smelly, you had to, like, it's just not a nice business working with animal hides that, that start to smell, and especially in hot areas. And these are images just for you to get an idea, in case you haven't seen the parchment making process. And we're dealing with like an animal skin here, and like you can see that reflected in the books that we look at. Yeah. And now we're getting to my manual, because so a few things are special about it. First of all, we have 11 folios that deal with parchment making, which is quite a lot if we compare that to other sources from like Latin, Christian accounts. That's like something unheard of that we don't have otherwise, not to that extent. Because, for example, we have this one from the 11th or 12th century, I think. Like very short descriptions and very academic, not very practical. And we're not going to read this because we don't have time. Then we have, for example, like a riddle, about parchment making. This is the longest account we have in Latin about an Italian, or like in Bologna, parchment making in Bologna. And that's maybe like the most practical account we have. And generally what we can say is that these accounts were written from a person standing behind the craftsperson, and observing that from a position of academic or social superiority, like I am doing now. Like, I have no idea how to practically make parchment. I only know the theory. And in the manual, instead, we see they have really, like, they have insights into practical matters, like how long a skin should be soaked in water. Like, they can tell from the level of dryness. They know it by the thickness of the skin. And they have, like, little tips, like, oh, mark your skin before you process it, so you remember which one was the hairy side and which the fleshy side, in case you can't differentiate it anymore afterwards. And then also statements like, this is how I personally do it. A quick excursion to the Talmudic tanning of skins, because they differ a little bit of how it was later then made in Europe. And we basically have 4 steps, really, really simplified. We put the skin in salt water, let it soak. Then in like a mixture, like a solution of flour that has been fermented. Then in a tanning solution, which was, like in the Talmud, is referred to be'afatzim, so like with gallnut. And then usually you would dry them. We have also accounts where dog dung is used to improve the skins, but for holy scrolls, that was out of question. And then translated that into into parchment for Torah scrolls, we have 3 different types, which are traditionally defined like this, but there are also other ways to define them. So there's like a controversy about it, but this is the standard way, I would say. And there we say that we see that the gvil is usually for the Torah, like we saw with the Sephardic scrolls. Then klav for tefillin, and dursustus for the mezuzah. And then there are 3 types of skins that are unfit for writing a Torah on, and those are not allowed to be used. And then interestingly, this art of splitting a skin into 2 halves, that apparently wasn't known in Europe at all. So that seemed to have been like a thing they did in Babylon, but then that kind of got lost. So we have, for example, Chai Gaon, he saw it, and he reports it in a responsa, but in medieval Germany, that was something the artist didn't know. And then if we look at the if we make a little excursion to the, so because in Europe, if we go back, in Europe what they would do instead of the be'afatzim, like with the afatzim, the gallnut, they would put it into a lime solution. And that then was a controversy in terms of, okay, can we actually do it, because it's not the Talmudic method. And in the Arabic lands they had a similar change, because there they had a mixture of using the Talmudic process, like they salted it or put it in a salt solution, and then they used lime as well. And that was already a controversy back then with the Geonim. And they kind of reached the conclusion that it was okay. That was before it even became a debate in Europe. And now the second excursion with to Greece or Greek language is when we look at the terminology used in Baruch Shama, because here and then it uses incorporates German words into the text. So, for example, when it comes to the hairy side of the skin, they say, or b'lashon Ashkenaz, it's called nerve or nerve. And I found that in the dictionary for Old German. And it's kind of, the definition given is the hairy side of a tanned hide. And then interestingly, in 2 other manuscripts of Baruch Shama, they give a term, b'lashon Ivan, tzipa. And there I kind of want to ask the Greek speakers here if they know this term, because I found tzipa like this in a dictionary as an alternative word for derma. Like we all know dermatology, but I don't know if tzipa is used at all, and I would be interested to hear. It is a Greek word. Yeah. And do you refer to like human skin like this, or is it like, does it have a connotation like?
If somebody you cannot trust him or this, we say he doesn't have tzibra. It means he is not ashamed of what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe that means the skin.
Okay.
Changes the skin.
Like he doesn't have thick enough skin to be
Yes,
strong
he
about
or
something.
he has yes,
His expression, you.
to be trusted or to be.
Okay. Yeah, that's
He's
interesting.
not ashamed of what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
We use the word tzipa.
Okay. Okay, interesting.
But it's something that it covers, like also when you boil the milk, on the top it comes on the, we call it also tzipa.
Okay, then it would fit, kind of, because the hairy side would be the outer layer of the skin, right? The crust, yeah? Okay. Pelle?
Also in Italian, pelle is
Mm-hmm.
skin.
Yeah, yeah. Especially it's interesting because the manuscripts do not show any connection to anything Greek. So I don't know how Greek words came into that, or why the scribe thought it was interesting to know that in Greece, or I don't know, in the Greek language, they refer to this term like this. But maybe I'll find more information. We'll see. So then the statement that because in Europe the parchment was made with lime and was kind of the pergament that people used. There's this Menachem Haran said, well, the Jews then adopted it without any hesitation, that this was the accepted equivalent to the Talmudic way of doing parchment. And Annette basically refuted that and by showing the halachic discussions about this and said, well, they didn't accept this without hesitation, but actually it was a big halachic debate, which I'm not going to display here because that would we don't have time for that. So we can rule that out, and instead what we see in the halachic or in the manual handbook literature is that there's an emphasis on processing them lishma, so for a certain purpose or like with a dedication in mind. So then in Baruch Shema we have the phrasing, so when you put them in water, like the hides, you should say, for the Holy Torah of Israel, for the sake of Tefillin and Mezuzot and Kemain, I put these hides in water. And it's very important to say this out loud. And this goes back to a Talmudic practice or Talmudic debate about whether, that they have to be, like the Rashbag said, they have to be processed lishma. And there's also a debate about it, but it will go beyond the scope. And exactly. So, and basically, it's because of Rabbeinu Tam from the 12th century who kind of made this acceptable within Europe, and he's also quoted in the manual. Exactly. And there's an example of Döringen, from Thüringen, where apparently the Jews didn't make it like this and didn't process skins correctly. So I always like these little snippets because that's where the manual becomes a historical witness and tells us about practices or perhaps malpractices. So we've established this is not correct, and the whole handling of putting skins into water and saying something about it, like dedicating them. This we also see reflected in guilds. So apparently, when there was the master of the guild, he would remain or hold the privilege of putting the skins into water, like starting the process, And then all skins made in that guild were considered made by him. And so perhaps this is also something we find in the non-Jewish environment, that they then picked up on, okay, if the Jew puts the skins in the water, then basically the parchment was made by Jews, even if perhaps a non-Jew continued the parchment process. That is because the one argument is often that Jews were excluded from guild membership. But we actually have a very important source from Esslingen in 1331, where there's the old German, then the kind of modern German that I put, and an English translation, where Jewish people are admitted to the guild, like they can buy themselves into the guild and they can remain Jewish. So they don't have to, because guilds were often connected to very Christian rites, so you would go to Mass together, you'd have to be baptized. But this source actually states that you can remain Jewish and live as a Jew in all respects if you choose to join the guild. So this the stereotype that Jews were radically excluded from guild membership is not quite true. And actually I found many sources from parchment making or for Jewish parchment making in these areas. However, they're all a bit later, so they're all 14th, 15th century, so we don't have anything earlier than that. Those are the examples. Okay, maybe we skip this. Or just really quickly. So why is it so difficult to find evidence for Jewish craftsmen or parchment makers? One reason could be, so Michael Toch has made this amazing study about Nuremberg, and there's a census, and he has listed all the different professions and how many people were in it. And we see that out of the 76 male Jews that were counted, 11 were craftsmen. So about 14%. But the thing is, he could actually locate every single person from the census in the houses in Nuremberg, except for the craftsmen. He couldn't figure out where they lived. So perhaps they lived outside the city, which makes sense for tanners, especially because they had to be near a river. They would produce smelly, smelly whatever products. And then also the thing is that he and Asaf said that yesterday very correctly, that many people had often one person would hold 3 different professions in a given community. So we have an account where one guy is he's a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, and an innkeeper, and then a third thing at the same time. Maybe Chazan. Is that the Chazan? Yeah. Okay. So I think, and also perhaps these craftsmen actually escaped the census in the sense that maybe they were excluded from paying taxes because they were kind of part of the Jewish community but not subjected to fees, especially if they lived outside the city. And one example, for example, he gives is mikvaot. So we have many mikvahs in many places, but on only 3 accounts we have people that actually tended to the mikvaot, staff for the bath. But does that then make us conclude, okay, we have mikvaot in all those places, but there were no people tending to them? And I think that's probably a wrong conclusion, because we probably had them, we just don't have records of them. Yep, okay, we can skip this. This as well. This as well. And I just want to finish with an example of where Jews and Gentiles make parchment together in the Scribes manual. And, not this one, sorry. Here. So, because the manual deals with all parts of making tefillin, so there's also one part where it is about making parchment black for the tefillin cases. And he says, okay, well, the best way for the Jew is to do this, to make the dye, the blackening liquid inside the Jewish home. But if he doesn't have the material, he can also go and and get the ingredients from a Jewish, from a non-Jewish craftsman. And in general, what Rabbi Abraham says, well, the Jewish worker himself, he must dye the skin black. But Samson doesn't have, that's the gloss 16, he doesn't actually have a problem with the Gentile also making the skin black, because he says, oh yeah, touching the skin or handling it doesn't diminish the holiness of the hide at all. And that's actually quite contrary to what scholarship has so far thought about parchment making, that, you know, there was this huge divide between Jews and Christians, and here we see actually it wasn't that much of a big deal. Yeah. So yeah, I couldn't find that many historic sources for parchment making in medieval Ashkenaz, but or not as many as I thought I would, to refute this standard in scholarship that there weren't any. But I think we're in a good way to kind of break up the stereotypes and show that there were exceptions, that there are other ways of looking at this. And a big part plays the Scribe manual I'm working on, I think, because it shows that there were indeed Jews making parchment. And yeah, and the principal aim, or like one of the big principles, wasn't a separation per se between Jews and Christians making parchment, but actually there was a working together, and Jews were perhaps even admitted to guilds, and Jews perhaps also employed Gentiles working in their houses, in Jewish houses, making parchment with them. Yeah. So thank you so much.
It's very reasonable to think that the Jews were in charge, and why not the Sofrim, in preparing the parchment, because of the kosher slaughtering. I mean, if you go to the origin, probably they would take mainly cow leather from the cows that they had slaughtered in their own hands. So why is it even a question? I wonder. I just wonder why is it even a question if the Jews or the Sofrim had prepared their own cloth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because so parchment has to be made from a kosher animal, like a kosher land animal. And it's true, it doesn't even have to be slaughtered. It could also be exactly like nowadays equivalent would be like roadkill. If you hit a deer with a car, you can still make parchment from it. You're not allowed to eat it, but you can make parchment. And so exactly, you could also get Gentile meat, basically, or like the skins of animals slaughtered by Gentiles. And I think the scholarship has, I haven't been able to go really much into the Sefer Hasidim, but those texts give like a very secluded image of they make a lot of panic in terms of, oh, Jews, don't let the Gelach, like the monk, touch your books. And they also elevated, so not just a Torah scroll, but they also elevated the oral Torah, so that anything like Mishnaic or Talmudic written on parchment was elevated onto a holiness level. And they were really like warning Jews not to engage with Christians or let them touch their books. And I think scholarship has only focused so far on those texts, or mainly, and got an idea that somehow they were very separated. And I think because of the lack of sources, that's why. Yeah. But you can add, yeah.
You could ask the other way around. Why is it such a big issue in the rabbinical literature in this time? All this parchment making thing. So maybe, I don't know, what yours?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. That's where you have also written a lot on the status, right, of the scrolls and levels of holiness and ideas of, or conceptions of holiness.
So for me, because it's so many treatises on these subjects in all kinds of rabbinical literature and scribe manuals, that I had got the feeling, or so maybe they excluded from some word. Why they talking about if it would be if it was normal to prepare your own parchment, maybe they would not write about it the entire time. So it's could be the other way around. Yeah. I don't think it was like a normal thing to prepare your own parchment in this time. Also because it's a dirty, it's really a work, to do. And I have two questions, or one question. What is the argument, or the arguments of Elisheva Baumgarten, that she said that tefillin were not wear in this time, or from the 13th to 14th century only?
Well, she says that it wasn't it wasn't, first of all, it wasn't community consensus that it was super important. And then she says material costs, like it was just, and in the Scribes manual here you also see the Samson says, people don't have mezuzot on their houses, and when they buy tefillin, all they care about is that they're cheap and they don't look at quality. So it does seem to have been but I don't think she goes really into depth with that question. She just picks up on a few.
Two legs. Two legs.
Thank you. And thank you so much. It's such an interesting area to think about. But I'm wondering, because there was a schism somewhere in the greater community in terms of craft guilds. Mm-hmm. And so maybe this was a part of the image we have of this being a big problem, because the Jews were asked to pay to be admitted to the guild of the tanners. And this already makes it a larger decision, a more difficult decision for a Jew to become a member, and also the awareness of his fellow workers that he's different. Mm-hmm. And so on a human community level, this is also to me a divisive thing.
Mm-hmm. That's a comment, right? Not a question so much. Or is it? Is there a question I'm hearing or not? Because I think it's a very helpful comment. Yeah.
It's more of a comment.
Exactly.
But it could be why we perceive this as a problem. Mm-hmm. The making of the parchment yourself, or the dyeing of the...
Like, you mean it's more cost effective for the community if they have their own professional doing...
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you would be...
Personally, your children going to school, or you would be looked upon differently. Mm-hmm. So there is maybe it's a bigger deal than we're perceiving from the scholarship.
Yeah, and I also think it depends a lot on the size of a community. I think if there's a considerably sized Jewish community, I personally think it very highly unlikely that they didn't have their own scribes who made their own parchment. I don't know, just from a practical point, as you said, it's just, I think that because of the lack of sources, that there has been this certain stereotype in scholarship, and I think we need to break it apart through debates like this, a little bit. And I think another reason why Jews should make their own parchment was this rise in the Tosafist movement of going back, to the Talmud and really interpreting it in a new way, and putting an emphasis on religious practice. Because Samson, for example, he wanted to make sure that people wear tefillin, but what he was more interested in even was that they were wearing the right ones, or like correctly processed, correctly produced ones. And for that, if the parchment is not produced lishma, then it's not a holy device, like a holy item. Then praying with it doesn't make sense. So I think from that point of view, it's very important that we control the process and how it's made. Yeah.
Thank you.
Like there's another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, thanks so much. Anyway, thank you so much for this presentation. I just want to add something to your argument, because I think what we very often see in I can only really speak about later halachic sources, but in the Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries, right, there's so much focus on this relationship between Jews and non-Jews in the parchment making, because there are many details surrounding it, right? Many considerations. When does a Jew need to be present? And what does he need to say? Does he need to say it out loud? What if he forgets about it? What if he is kind of nervous about saying it in front of the non-Jew? And so I think, at least in the later halachic text, this notion of, okay, non-Jews now also part of this process, negotiating this in connection with considerations of lishma, makes up such a takes up such a big space, which might skew a bit our perception that, in many cases, what they are discussing in detail about non-Jewish participation in parchment, that might have been, only an exception, or something that's not necessarily so common, because again, very often Jewish law focuses on these kind of defined borderline cases. But I think when we look at the broader historical developments that I've seen in my manuals from the 19th century, that definitely there was a move towards more involvement of non-Jewish tanners. For example, in one manual, there's a particular Jewish tanner is highlighted and quoted, but he's also described as one of the few scribes who are involved in the tanning industry. So I think there must have been a slow development, but it could be that this development towards non-Jewish tanners was not as early as the consensus says, and you're giving quite a lot of evidence that move might have been a bit later. Yeah,
thank you for that. And if I can just briefly add for 1 minute, that's interesting, because I also saw that, for example, with Hameiri in Perpignan, he says many people rule the Mahmir decision, basically that the Jew should do the whole thing, and no non-Jew should be involved. But then that was not realistic, because if the place didn't have, then maybe you needed some non-Jewish involvement. And equally, I found a response from Yemen, where Rabbi said, well, there shouldn't be. This is for a case where there are no Jewish tanners around. But because here in Yemen we have enough Jewish tanners, a Gentile should not be involved. So, and even though that was from the 18th century, I feel like that reflects perhaps the kind of spirit behind it, that really it was for exceptional cases. The best way of fulfilling the mitzvah is really if the Jew does it by himself. Yeah. Super.
Thank you.